Beneath the gilded ceilings and behind the thick stone walls of the world's most famous palaces, a quiet battle has been raging for decades, fought not with weapons, but with the subtle choices of duty, silence, and the heavy burden of the royal birthright. The public has long been captivated by the spectacular acts of rebellion, the fiery declarations of independence, and the high-profile courtroom battles that seem to dominate the modern headlines, drawing our collective gaze toward those who choose to loudly challenge the ancient institution of the monarchy. We watch in real time as public figures cross oceans, launch multimedia campaigns, and turn their private grievances into global commodities, creating a spectacle that feels entirely modern yet deeply destructive to the fabric of tradition. It is incredibly easy to get swept up in this whirlwind of noise, to believe that the only stories worth telling are the ones shouted from the rooftops of California or broadcast through the lens of high-stakes documentary series. But if you pause for just a moment and look past the flashbulbs and the furious press statements, you will discover that a far more fascinating and revealing drama is unfolding in the quiet corners of the royal estate, where a completely different path has been chosen. If you appreciate these deep dives into the hidden dynamics of fame and history, please take a brief second to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode as we unravel these complex human stories. The contrast between these two entirely different approaches to a shared destiny tells us everything we need to know about character, resilience, and the true cost of living life in the permanent shadow of a throne. For years, the global media has focused its absolute attention on the narrative of the bitter exile, the spare heir who felt chewed up and spit out by the royal machine and who chose to wage an eternal, exhausting war against his own bloodline. We have become accustomed to the regular drumbeat of complaint, the legal crusades against the press, and the profound sense of grievance that seems to dictate every public appearance of the Duke of Sussex. Yet this very week, a parallel narrative has emerged from the shadows of history to completely reframe how we view the trials of royal life, proving that the burden of being a younger sibling in the line of succession can be carried in a radically different manner. While one prince continues to single-handedly diminish his own public, standing through a series of chaotic and emotionally charged legal battles, another figure from the older generation has been quietly demonstrating what it truly means to survive the ultimate public humiliation without ever losing one's poise. It is a story that takes us back to the glamorous, high-stakes world of the late 1980s. A time when the British tabloid press was at its most predatory, and the younger members of the royal family were desperately trying to carve out individual identities away from the rigid expectations of the crown. This week, the British public was treated to a sudden, startling blast from the past as a new autobiography by a prominent West End theatre star burst onto the front pages, threatening to completely upend the carefully constructed image of a happily married, deeply traditional royal duke. Suddenly, a gentleman who is now widely regarded as the very definition of a dull, dutiful servant of the monarchy was plunged back into a vivid, passion-drenched past that he had undoubtedly hoped was safely buried in the archives of history. The revelations contained within the pages of this book are nothing short of explosive, detailed in a breathless prose that exposes the intimate, chaotic, and often cringeworthy realities of a 5-year love affair that occurred long before the world ever heard of modern royal rifts. It brings into sharp focus a time when a young royal prince, having controversially walked away from a prestigious career in the military, decided to throw himself entirely into the volatile world of commercial musical theatre. In doing so, he entered a vibrant, uninhibited universe filled with ambitious artists, late-night rehearsals, and the intense magnetism of the stage, a world that was diametrically opposed to the stiff formalities of Buckingham Palace. It was here that he crossed paths with a dazzling 20-year-old actress who was currently starring in a major production, a woman possessed of a self-described potty mouth and a complete lack of traditional royal deference. What followed was a whirlwind romance that shattered every unwritten rule of royal decorum, featuring secret assignations inside the private apartments of the palace, late-night encounters that left the young prince utterly exhausted before his official duties, and a level of bold, unvarnished flirting that the royal household was completely unprepared to handle. The sheer contrast between this historical romance and the modern, highly litigated grievances of the current generation provides a profound lesson in how different individuals handle the intense pressures of global scrutiny. As we look closely at the details of this long-forgotten affair, we are forced to confront the reality that every single member of this extraordinary family must eventually play the hand that fate has dealt them, negotiating the highest highs and the lowest lows under the unblinking eye of the public. Some choose to barrel around the world like a furious banshee, demanding endless status, absolute respect, and continuous amends from both their families and their perceived enemies, while demanding absolutely nothing of themselves in return. Others, when faced with the sudden exposure of their deepest private secrets or the memory of their most embarrassing youthful missteps, choose to simply straighten their tie, put one polished brogue in front of the other, and quietly get on with the job at hand. The unfolding drama of this week has laid bare these two competing philosophies of royal survival, showing that while the noisy battles of Montecito capture the immediate headlines, it is the quiet, unbreakable poise of the dutiful Duke that may ultimately prevail in the end. As the details of this passionate West End romance continue to dominate the public conversation, we are left to wonder how a man who once faced intense criticism for his failed business ventures and public humiliations managed to emerge from this fresh trial with his dignity entirely intact. The curtain has been lifted on an era that the palace authorities had long considered a closed chapter, revealing the sheer intensity of a romance that unfolded behind closed doors, while the late Queen Elizabeth II navigated the turbulent waters of the late 1980s. The individual at the absolute centre of this sudden storm is none other than Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a man who has spent the last several decades cultivating an image of absolute stability, quiet dedication, and predictable service to the British state. To understand the profound impact of the recent revelations published by West End star Ruthie Henshall in her autobiography, one must revisit the specific historical atmosphere of 1988. A year when the youngest son of the monarch made the shocking and highly controversial decision to resign from his grueling training within the Royal Marines. This sudden departure from a traditional military career path deeply disappointed his father, Prince Philip, and ignited a media firestorm that painted the young prince as an eccentric outsider who preferred the creative uncertainty of the theatre to the rigid discipline of the armed forces. Undeterred by the intense public scrutiny and the quiet disapproval of his family, Edward secured a modest position working for Andrew Lloyd Webber's theatrical production company, determined to prove that he could forge a legitimate career based on merit rather than mere hereditary privilege. It was within this highly charged, creative environment that he encountered the vibrant 20-year-old actress who was currently performing as Jemima in the hit musical Cats, initiating a secret relationship that would last for 5 passionate years. Ruthie Henshall writes with an astonishing, almost breathless level of candor about how she deliberately targeted the young prince the moment she discovered a member of the royal family was working on the theatrical premises, viewing the connection as both an exciting personal coup and a thrilling adventure. Her unvarnished descriptions detail a young woman who was completely untamed by the traditional protocols of high society, arriving at encounters wearing tiny rah-rah skirts and thigh-high socks, and using her self-described potty mouth to flirt with a prince who had likely never experienced such uninhibited behavior from the women of his social circle. The sheer velocity of their connection completely overwhelmed the young royal, who found himself utterly captivated by a woman who represented the absolute antithesis of the stiff, formal world he had inhabited since birth. Within a remarkably short period, the ambitious chorus girl had bypassed the formidable security apparatus of the monarchy, finding herself sharing an intimate space within Edward's private quarters at Buckingham Palace. Her detailed accounts do not spare a single element of their physical intimacy, revealing to the public that the young prince actually had his official royal title of His Royal Highness Edward meticulously sewn into the labels of his undergarments. She describes a lover who was deeply romantic, exceptionally gentle, and undeniably experienced, completely dismantling the unfair and mocking stereotypes that the contemporary British press had frequently used to diminish his masculinity. The relationship continued at a breathless pace for half a decade, with the actress proudly noting that she would frequently exhaust the young prince to the point of complete oblivion, leaving him visibly bleary-eyed and drained when he was forced to rise early the next morning to fulfill his official duties on behalf of the crown. This vivid, highly descriptive trip down memory lane has undoubtedly caused an immense amount of acute embarrassment for a 62-year-old Duke who is now happily married to the Duchess of Edinburgh and has 2 grown children navigating their own private lives. Yet, as the public devours these highly intimate details, an incredibly strange and unexpected phenomenon has occurred, as Prince Edward has actually emerged from this potentially damaging exposure looking remarkably decent, honourable, and deeply human. Unlike the modern narratives of rejection and coldness that have been popularized by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, this historical account demonstrates that the royal family and their immediate staff were consistently warm, remarkably accommodating, and deeply kind to the young showgirl, despite her highly unconventional background and filterless vocabulary. Edward actively introduced his theatrical lover to the innermost circle of the monarchy, bringing her into the deeply private landscapes of Balmoral and Windsor Castle, where she participated in the family's traditional gatherings without facing the immediate hostility that modern critics often attribute to the institution. The stark contrast between this harmonious, albeit hidden, past and the relentless public warfare currently being waged from California highlights a profound generational divide in how individual royals handle the inevitable complexities of their unique positions. While the current public discourse is dominated by the bitter legal actions of Prince Harry, who recently launched a hot-headed press statement blaming the entire British media landscape for his personal privacy losses, the Duke of Edinburgh has chosen a completely different strategy. He has responded to the sudden, highly public excavation of his youthful playboy years by keeping his head down, maintaining an absolute public silence, and refusing to grant the media the satisfaction of a defensive reaction. This complete refusal to engage in public emotionalism is precisely what separates the steady, enduring members of the old guard from the chaotic, self-destructive, modern exiles who seem trapped in a permanent cycle of grievance. The ability to endure public exposure with a quiet, unshakable dignity is a trait that Prince Edward developed through decades of facing his own intense personal trials and creative failures. The public often forgets that long before he became the reliable Duke of Edinburgh, Edward was subjected to intense national mockery, most notably when he organised the disastrous television special It's a Royal Knockout, which saw members of the royal family wearing silk knickerbockers and participating in ridiculous game show stunts that critics claimed cheapened the monarchy. He also faced severe professional ruin when his independent television company, Ardent Productions, was caught violating an explicit media agreement by filming his young nephew, Prince William, during his university years at St. Andrews, an incident that caused a massive rift with his older brother, King Charles. Yet through every single one of these profound humiliations, many of which were entirely of his own making, Edward never once transformed his private embarrassment into a loud, commercialized crusade against his own family or the British state. He chose instead to absorb the heavy blows of public criticism, quietly dismantling his failing business ventures and dedicating himself entirely to the unglamorous, repetitive grind of official royal engagements and charitable work. As we watch this historical drama unfold alongside the contemporary chaos of the modern court, it becomes increasingly clear that the true test of royal survival is not how loudly one can complain about the constraints of the system, but how gracefully one can execute the duties of the role while keeping one's private vulnerabilities hidden from the world. The profound difference in how these two royal figures have managed the hand that destiny dealt them ultimately reveals a deeper truth about the modern evolution of the British monarchy and the enduring power of quiet resilience over public theatricality. When we examine the biography of Prince Edward, born the last child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, we see an individual who was structurally destined to be an even more distant spare than Prince Harry could ever claim to be. In the rigid geometry of the line of succession, a fourth child is routinely pushed to the absolute periphery of national awareness, inheriting all of the suffocating public scrutiny and restrictive protocols of royal status, with almost none of the direct political relevance or historical destiny enjoyed by the immediate heirs to the throne. Yet, rather than allowing this structural marginalization to breed a toxic cocktail of resentment and permanent victimhood, the Duke of Edinburgh has spent decades transforming his secondary status into a masterclass of steady, uncomplaining service. He has consistently demonstrated a cheerful demeanor and a fortitudinous manner that stands as a direct, unvarnished rebuke to the loud, multi-million-dollar grievances echoing continuously from the hills of Montecito, while the younger prince appears permanently locked in a painful, cyclical uprising within his own brain, fighting an endless war against a media landscape he detests yet constantly feeds. His uncle has mastered the subtle art of emotional self-regulation. Edward clearly understood early in his adult life that the complex puzzle of royal existence cannot be solved by demanding that the world bend to your emotional needs, but rather by recognizing that the crown demands an absolute subordination of the individual ego to the larger continuity of the state. This enduring commitment to duty has allowed him to transition seamlessly into the massive shoes of his late father, taking over the Duke of Edinburgh title and championing the massive youth development programs that constitute a vital, lasting pillar of the royal family's connection to the British public. The historical record shows that Edward was not always the perfectly polished, universally respected pillar of the establishment that we see today, but rather a deeply human individual who had to learn the lessons of dignity through the brutal, unforgiving crucible of public failure. His early theatrical aspirations, his sudden and highly criticized exit from the Royal Marines, and the eventual painful collapse of his independent media company were all accompanied by intense national derision and immense family tension. Even his romantic life was subjected to sudden jolts of intense public exposure, such as the highly stressful moment when racy, intimate photographs of his then-fiancée Sophie Rhys-Jones were leaked to a predatory tabloid press just days before their highly anticipated royal wedding at St. George's Chapel. Yet, throughout every single one of these deeply distressing personal and professional crises, Edward never once picked up a microphone to alienate his family, nor did he ever seek to commodify his private pain for international consumption. Instead, he leaned heavily on the quiet, steady support of Sophie, who has herself evolved into the saintly, universally admired Duchess of Edinburgh, creating a stable, dignified family unit that stands as a model of contemporary royal responsibility. Their two grown children, Lady Louise and James, the Earl of Wessex, are being raised with an acute awareness of public duty, combined with a strict preservation of their private lives, demonstrating that it is indeed entirely possible to navigate the modern world as a member of the royal house without succumbing to the toxic lure of permanent celebrity culture. The ultimate irony of the recent revelations by Ruthie Henshall is that despite the deeply embarrassing, highly descriptive nature of the text, the story actually reveals a deeply endearing, fiercely loyal side to the young prince that the public had never previously been permitted to see. The actress paints a vivid picture of a young man who, despite his royal pedigree and the heavy expectations of his station, was entirely capable of writing genuine love notes, creating simple toasted cheese sandwiches for his partner, and extending a deep, protective warmth to her family. Even when the relationship naturally reached its conclusion as the realities of royal expectations inevitably clashed with the chaotic lifestyle of a West End performer, Edward managed to let her down with an exceptional gentleness that preserved their mutual respect. The fact that the two former lovers managed to remain genuine, supportive friends for several decades until the sudden commercial publication of this autobiography speaks volumes about the underlying integrity of the prince's character. It proves that even in his youth, during his absolute wild playboy years, he possessed a fundamental emotional intelligence and a capacity for genuine human connection that stood in stark contrast to the transactional, highly litigated relationships that seem to define the modern, fractured branches of the royal family tree. As the public reflects on this tumultuous week of contrasting royal behaviours, it becomes completely impossible not to contrast Edward's elegant silence with the chaotic, reactive nature of his nephew. Prince Harry's immediate reaction to his recent legal setbacks was characterized by a hot-headed, deeply defensive public statement that systematically sought to cast blame across the entire British establishment while refusing to acknowledge any personal missteps or strategic errors. This continuous, noisy battle against his own demons has done absolutely nothing to elevate his global standing, serving only to diminish his historical legacy and alienate the very public that once embraced him with open arms. Meanwhile, the Duke of Edinburgh simply straightens his tie, puts one highly polished brogue directly in front of the other, and quietly walks out into the British rain to open a community centre, support a youth charity, or stand representing the monarch at an ancient traditional ceremony. In this quiet, unshakable poise, we see the true survival mechanism of the British monarchy, an institution that has outlasted empires not because its members are perfect, but because they understand the profound value of endurance, discretion, and absolute silence in the face of temporary storms. While the sensational headlines from California will inevitably continue to flicker and burn with a temporary, destructive heat, it is the dull, dutiful, and profoundly steady Duke who will ultimately prevail, ensuring that the ancient fabric of the crown remains entirely unbroken for the generations yet to come.